My name is Georgia, and I'm 62 years old. Standing here outside First National Bank on this crisp October morning, I never imagined I'd be facing the biggest betrayal of my life. The man walking toward me with that expensive suit and cold smile used to be the little boy I'd rock to sleep every night. But today, David wasn't coming as my son. He was coming with his lawyer, ready to take everything I'd spent my lifetime building. The folder in my weathered hands held secrets that would shatter his confidence in minutes. Before I tell you what happened in that bank, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted most, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Now let me take you inside that room where my son tried to buy me off with $20,000 thinking I was just a naive old woman. I was born dirt poor on a farm in Iowa back in 1962. My mama died when I was just 7 years old, leaving me with a daddy who could barely keep food on our table. Life taught me early that if you wanted something, you had to fight for it with your bare hands. I married Robert when I was 19, a good man with calloused hands and big dreams. Together, we scraped together every penny we had and started a small construction business in our garage. Those early years were brutal. Robert would work construction sites during the day, and I'd handle the books at night after putting our baby David to sleep. We lived on beans and rice for months, pouring every dollar back into buying better tools and equipment. But we had hope. We had each other. And we had our beautiful boy who became the center of our universe. David was everything to us. When he took his first steps, Robert and I cheered like he'd won the Olympics. When he spoke his first word, "Mama," I cried happy tears for an hour. We promised each other that our son would never know the poverty we'd grown up with. He'd have every opportunity, every advantage we could possibly give him. The business grew slowly but steadily. Robert's reputation for honest work spread throughout the county. By the time David started school, we'd moved out of our tiny apartment into a real house with a yard where he could play. I still worked the books every night, but now I could afford to buy David new clothes instead of hand-me-downs from the church donation box. Then everything changed when David was 15. Robert was driving home from a job site on a rainy Thursday evening when a drunk driver ran a red light. The police officer who came to my door said Robert died instantly, that he didn't suffer. But I suffered enough for both of us. In one terrible moment, I became a widow and a single mother with a business to run and a teenage son who needed me more than ever. Those first months after Robert's funeral were the darkest of my life. David would find me crying over the account books late at night, trying to figure out how to keep the business afloat without my husband's expertise. But I refused to give up. This company was Robert's legacy and David's future. I hired foremen, learned construction management, and worked 18-hour days to keep every contract we'd signed. The sacrifice was worth it. By the time David graduated high school, our company had become one of the most respected construction firms in the state. We employed 40 people and had contracts worth millions. David was accepted to Harvard with a partial scholarship, and I proudly wrote the check for the remaining $60,000 in tuition. My boy was going to be a lawyer, something I'd only dreamed about during those hungry nights of my childhood. David thrived at Harvard just like I knew he would. He called home twice a week during his freshman year, telling me about his classes and the amazing professors who were shaping his mind. I'd stay up late just waiting for those calls, hungry for every detail about his new life. When he made the dean's list, I had the newspaper clipping framed and hung it in my office where every client could see how proud I was. But something started changing during his sophomore year. The calls became shorter, less frequent. When I asked about his studies, he'd give quick answers and change the subject. He started talking about his new friends differently, mentioning their family names like they should impress me. Williams, whose father owned half of Boston. Patterson, whose grandfather had been a senator. Names that meant money and power, things I'd never cared about before. During his junior year, David brought home a girlfriend for Thanksgiving. Amanda Patterson was everything I wasn't: tall, blonde, with perfect posture and a way of speaking that made every word sound like it came from a textbook. She shook my hand like she was afraid of catching something and spent the entire dinner talking about places I'd never heard of and people I'd never meet. I tried to be welcoming, asking about her studies and her family, but Amanda answered in polite sentences that felt like walls. When I served my famous apple pie, the one that David had always begged me to make, she took one tiny bite and pushed the rest around her plate. Later, I heard her whispering to David about how quaint everything was, like my home was some kind of museum display. David changed even more after that visit. The boy who used to brag about his mama's cooking now seemed embarrassed when I mentioned family traditions. He graduated summa cum laude, and I flew to Boston for the ceremony wearing my best dress and feeling so proud I thought my heart might burst. But during the reception, David introduced me to his professors and classmates with a forced smile like he was checking off items on a list. After graduation, David took a position at a prestigious law firm in Manhattan. The starting salary was more than I'd made in my first 5 years running the business. He married Amanda in a ceremony that cost more than my first house held at some exclusive country club where the waiters wore white gloves. I felt out of place among the orchids and champagne, but I smiled and wrote the check for my part of the expenses because David seemed happy. The visits home became rare events. Christmas, maybe Easter, if they didn't have other plans. David would arrive in expensive cars wearing suits that cost more than most people made in a month. He'd ask polite questions about the business but seemed distracted, always checking his phone for messages from his important New York life. Amanda never came back after the wedding. David always had an excuse. She was busy with charity work or visiting her parents in the Hamptons or dealing with some social obligation I wouldn't understand. The truth was becoming clear, though I didn't want to admit it. My son was ashamed of where he came from, and his wife wanted nothing to do with the woman who'd raised the man she married. The first real warning sign came on David's 35th birthday. I'd called to wish him well and mentioned that the business was having our best year ever. Instead of being happy, David sounded worried. He started asking detailed questions about my financial arrangements, whether I had proper estate planning, if I'd considered what would happen to all that money when I got older. At first, I thought he was just being a caring son. After all, I was 60 now, and running a construction company was young person's work. But the questions kept coming every time we talked. Had I updated my will recently? Did I have a financial advisor? Wouldn't it be smart to start transferring some assets while I was still healthy? And then David started visiting more often. But these weren't social calls. He'd arrive with briefcases full of papers and laptop computers talking about tax strategies and investment opportunities. He brought business associates who spoke in numbers and percentages, making my successful company sound like it was barely staying afloat. They'd spread documents across my kitchen table, pointing out problems I'd never noticed and solutions that always seemed to involve David taking more control. The suggestions started small. Maybe David should be added to the business bank accounts just in case something happened to me. Perhaps he should be listed as a co-owner on some of the properties to simplify future transactions. It would all be temporary, he assured me, just good planning for a woman my age. But every signature they requested seemed to give David more access to what I'd spent 40 years building. Amanda started calling, too, which she'd never done before. She'd ask sweetly about my health, whether I was feeling tired, if managing the business was becoming too stressful. These conversations always ended with gentle suggestions that I should consider slowing down, maybe letting the younger generation take over some responsibilities. Her concern felt as fake as her smile had at that long-ago Thanksgiving dinner. The biggest shock came during what I thought was a routine doctor's visit. I'd been having some chest pains and shortness of breath, nothing serious enough to worry about. But the cardiologist's examination revealed a heart condition that would require surgery. Not immediately life-threatening, he explained, but something that needed attention within the next year or two. I called David to let him know about the diagnosis, expecting comfort and support. Instead, his reaction was almost eager. He started talking immediately about the importance of getting my affairs in order before any medical procedures. What if something went wrong during surgery? Wouldn't I want to know that everything was properly arranged for the people I cared about? Within a week, David had arranged a meeting with a lawyer and a financial planner. We needed to discuss my will, my business succession plan, and the tax implications of my estate. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday at First National Bank, where I'd done business for over 30 years. David said the bank's conference room would be more professional than my kitchen table, more appropriate for such important decisions. Something about his urgency made me uncomfortable. I'd raised a smart boy, but I'd also built a successful business by trusting my instincts. Those instincts were telling me that David's sudden concern about my health and finances might not be coming from the loving place I wanted to believe. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, so I did what any smart businesswoman would do. I hired a private investigator to look into David's financial situation. If my son needed money, I wanted to help him. But if he was trying to manipulate me, I needed to know the truth. What Marcus Thompson uncovered made my blood run cold. David wasn't the successful Manhattan lawyer I thought he was. His law firm had let him go 6 months earlier due to poor performance and client complaints. He'd been borrowing money from anyone who'd lend it using his Harvard credentials and family connections to maintain appearances while his world crumbled around him. The worst part was Amanda. She hadn't just married David for love. Her family had financial problems of their own hidden behind their social status and country club memberships. They'd encouraged the marriage because they thought David would inherit substantial wealth from his successful mother. Now that David's own career had failed, Amanda was threatening divorce unless he could secure his inheritance immediately. But the discovery that shattered my heart completely was hidden in a folder of bank documents Marcus had obtained through his contacts. David had been forging my signature on loan applications using the business assets as collateral without my knowledge. He'd borrowed nearly $500,000 over the past year, money that was supposed to fund his failed investment schemes and keep Amanda from leaving him. The forged documents were sophisticated, clearly prepared with professional help. David had used his legal training to create paperwork that looked legitimate signatures that matched mine well enough to fool bank officers who saw thousands of documents every week. He'd stolen from me systematically, methodically, while pretending to be concerned about my welfare. Marcus had traced the money through several accounts. Some had gone to cover David's living expenses in Manhattan, maintaining the illusion of success. Some had been invested in real estate deals that had fallen through, losing everything. And some had simply disappeared, probably spent on keeping Amanda happy with jewelry and vacations while they planned to take everything I owned. I spent 3 sleepless nights staring at those documents, trying to understand how the baby I'd rocked to sleep had become someone capable of such betrayal. The little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard, declaring them the most beautiful flowers in the world. The teenager who'd cried in my arms after his father's funeral, promising we'd take care of each other forever. But the evidence was undeniable. David had been planning this theft for months, possibly years. The concerned phone calls, the estate planning suggestions, the urgent need to get my affairs in order before my surgery. It had all been a carefully orchestrated campaign to gain legal control over my assets before I discovered what he'd already stolen. I made my own plans then. If David wanted to play lawyer games with his old mother, he was about to discover that I hadn't survived 40 years in the construction business by being anybody's fool. I contacted my own attorney, a sharp woman named Sarah Chen who specialized in financial crimes. Together we prepared for David's Monday morning ambush with evidence he'd never expect his naive mother to possess. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, matching my mood as I walked into First National Bank. I dressed carefully for this performance, my best navy blue suit, the one I wore for important business presentations, and the pearl necklace Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary. I wanted to look like the successful businesswoman I was, not the helpless elderly victim David expected to manipulate. The conference room was on the second floor with tall windows overlooking Main Street and a polished mahogany table that reflected the morning light. I arrived early, wanting to choose my seat strategically. I picked the chair facing the door where I could watch everyone's expressions and reactions. The leather folder containing my evidence sat innocuously beside my purse, looking like just another collection of business papers. David arrived precisely at 9 o'clock with a man I didn't recognize. Richard Mills looked like Central Casting's idea of a lawyer's silver hair, expensive suit, and the kind of confident smile that probably impressed juries. He carried a briefcase that looked heavy with documents, and his handshake was firm enough to show he considered himself the most important person in the room. My son looked good, I had to admit. The suit fit perfectly. His shoes were polished to mirror brightness, and his haircut probably cost more than most people spent on groceries. But I could see the stress around his eyes, the tightness in his jaw that I remembered from his childhood when he'd done something wrong and was waiting to be caught. George Thompson, the bank's vice president, joined us a few minutes later. I'd known George for 15 years since he'd started as a junior loan officer and worked his way up through careful dedication and honest dealing. He looked uncomfortable this morning, like someone who'd been asked to participate in something that didn't sit right with his conscience. David started with small talk, asking about my health and expressing concern about my upcoming surgery. His voice carried the right notes of filial affection, but I could hear the rehearsal in it. This was a performance he'd practiced, probably with Amanda coaching him on which emotions to emphasize. Richard Mills took over the conversation smoothly, explaining that estate planning was a complex field requiring professional guidance. Too many families, he said, with practiced gravity had been torn apart by poor financial planning and unclear inheritance structures. He spoke about tax implications and probate procedures using technical language designed to make me feel overwhelmed and dependent on his expertise. I played my part perfectly, nodding uncertainly and asking simple questions that made me sound confused by the legal complexities. David relaxed visibly as Mills talked, probably thinking his manipulative plan was working exactly as designed. His confident smile grew wider with each passing minute, the same smile that had charmed teachers and judges throughout his life. The moment of truth arrived when Richard Mills opened his briefcase and spread documents across the polished table. These were the papers David had prepared, the legal instruments that would transfer my life's work into his control. Mills explained each document with the patronizing patience of someone addressing a child, pointing out signature lines and emphasizing how these arrangements would protect me from future worries. David leaned forward, then his eyes bright with anticipation. This was his moment, the culmination of months of planning and manipulation. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a cashier's check, placing it on the table with a flourish that would have been impressive if I hadn't known what was really happening. $20,000. That's what my son thought I was worth after 40 years of building a business, after sacrificing everything to give him opportunities I'd never had. The check sat there on the mahogany table like an insult made tangible, the final proof of how little David valued everything I'd given him. His voice was smooth as expensive whiskey when he spoke. This money would be enough for me to live comfortably, he explained, without the stress of running a business or worrying about complex financial decisions. I had earned the right to relax, to enjoy my remaining years without the burden of responsibility. All I had to do was sign these simple papers and he'd take care of everything else. The confidence in his voice was absolute. David truly believed he was going to walk out of that bank with control over assets worth nearly $2 million, leaving me with a check that wouldn't cover 6 months of basic living expenses. He exchanged satisfied glances with Richard Mills, two predators who thought they'd cornered helpless prey. George Thompson was staring at the papers with obvious discomfort, his professional ethics warring with his reluctance to interfere in a family matter. I could see him trying to calculate whether these documents were legitimate, whether his bank was about to become part of something that would haunt his conscience later. The room had grown very quiet. Outside the tall windows, I could hear the normal sounds of Monday morning cars passing on Main Street, people walking to work, the ordinary rhythm of a town going about its business. But inside this conference room, the silence felt heavy with anticipation and hidden agendas. David's confident smile reached its peak as he pushed the transfer documents toward me across the table. The pen was already in his hand, offered like a gift that would solve all my problems. This was the moment he'd been working toward for months, the payoff for all his careful manipulation and false concern. But I didn't reach for his pen. Instead, I opened my leather folder and removed the stack of papers I'd brought with me. The first document was a copy of one of David's forged loan applications, his fake signature clearly visible next to a photocopy of my real one for comparison. I placed it on the table with the same careful precision he'd used for his check. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet. It was the complete absence of sound that comes when time seems to stop and everyone's world shifts on its axis. David's confident smile didn't fade gradually. It disappeared instantly, like someone had flipped a switch and turned off all the electricity in his face. I placed the second document on the table, bank records showing the unauthorized loans David had taken using forged signatures. Then the third, a private investigator's report detailing David's financial situation and Amanda's ultimatum about the divorce. Each paper landed on that polished mahogany surface with the soft whisper of truth, destroying lies. Richard Mills went pale as courthouse marble. His expensive briefcase suddenly looked like a prop in a play that had taken an unexpected turn toward reality. His hands fluttered over his own documents like he was trying to make them disappear through sheer force of will. George Thompson leaned forward to examine my papers, his banker's training taking over from his personal discomfort. I watched his expression change as he recognized the loan documents, understanding flooding his features like sunrise over a landscape. These were transactions he'd approved based on forged authorization, and the liability implications were staggering. But it was David's face that broke my heart completely. The confident mask crumbled away, revealing the terrified little boy I remembered from his childhood nightmares. His hands were shaking as he reached toward the papers, as if touching them might somehow make the evidence disappear. The successful Manhattan lawyer facade collapsed, leaving only a desperate man who'd been caught in an elaborate web of his own weaving. My voice was steady when I finally spoke, though my heart was breaking with every word. I explained that I'd known about his deception for weeks, that every concerned phone call and estate planning suggestion had been transparent manipulation to someone who'd spent 4 decades making real business decisions. The private investigator's report had revealed everything: the failed career, the failing marriage, the systematic theft of money he'd never earned. The $20,000 check looked pathetic now, sitting abandoned on the table like a joke that had fallen flat. This was what David thought would buy his mother's silence, buy his way out of criminal liability for forgery and fraud. $20,000 for a woman who'd built a multi-million-dollar company through honest work and sacrifice. David tried to speak, then his voice cracking like it had when he was 13, and trying to explain a broken window. He started with denials, then switched to justifications, then finally collapsed into desperate pleading. He needed the money to save his marriage, to pay off debts that were destroying his life. Amanda would leave him if he couldn't secure his inheritance. His career was over without the financial security he'd always expected to inherit. But I was done being manipulated by the son I'd raised to be better than this. I gathered my papers and stood up from the table, my leather folder held like armor against any further emotional attacks. The meeting was over, I announced. My attorney would be in contact with both David and Richard Mills about the criminal charges I intended to file. George Thompson was already reaching for his phone, probably to call the bank's legal department. Richard Mills was stuffing papers into his briefcase with shaking hands, his professional reputation crumbling around him like a house of cards in a strong wind. And David just sat there staring at the table where his confident smile had died just minutes before. The weeks that followed were both the hardest and most liberating of my life. Filing criminal charges against my own son felt like cutting out part of my heart with a dull knife, but the alternative was allowing him to destroy both of us with his deception and greed. Sarah Chen, my attorney, guided me through the legal process with the same thorough professionalism that had built her reputation in financial crime cases. David's world collapsed with breathtaking speed. Amanda filed for divorce before the criminal charges were even formally announced, taking half of what little legitimate assets remained after the failed investments and forged loans. The Manhattan social circle that had embraced them as a power couple suddenly had no memory of ever knowing them well. Amanda's family distanced themselves so quickly it was like David had never existed in their world. Richard Mills faced disbarment proceedings for his role in the attempted fraud. The State Bar Association took a dim view of attorneys who helped clients forge documents and manipulate elderly family members. His expensive law firm quietly removed his name from their letterhead and settled several civil suits to avoid further publicity. The bank recovered most of the stolen money through insurance and asset seizure, but George Thompson never looked at me quite the same way again. Our business relationship remained professional, but the easy friendship we'd developed over 15 years had been poisoned by the knowledge that my own son had made him an unwitting accomplice to financial fraud. But the real healing started when I began to rebuild my life around truth instead of illusion. For years, I'd defined myself primarily as David's mother, the woman who'd sacrificed everything to give her son opportunities. When that identity crumbled, I discovered I was still Georgia Miller, the tough farm girl who'd built a successful business and survived losing the love of her life. I sold the construction company to my most trusted foreman, a good man who'd worked beside me for 20 years and understood the values Robert and I had tried to build into every project. The sale price was fair, providing me with enough money to live comfortably without the daily stress of managing 40 employees and million-dollar contracts. I started traveling, then something I'd never had time for during the busy years of building the business. I visited places I'd only read about in magazines, the Rocky Mountains where I hiked trails that challenged my heart condition and my spirit equally, the beaches of California where I learned to paint watercolor sunsets that captured the beauty I'd been too busy to notice, the cities of Europe where I walked cobblestone streets that had existed for centuries before my small-town problems ever began. Along the way, I met other women who'd survived their own betrayals and disappointments. Mary from Denver, who'd lost her husband to another woman after 30 years of marriage. Susan from Boston, whose daughter had stolen her retirement savings to fund a drug addiction. Patricia from Seattle, whose business partner had embezzled everything they'd built together. We formed an unlikely friendship based on shared strength rather than shared wounds. These women taught me that survival wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending it didn't hurt. Real healing came from accepting the pain while refusing to let it define your future. We learned to laugh again, to trust carefully but genuinely, to find joy in simple pleasures that didn't require anyone else's approval or participation. David tried to contact me several times during those first months. Letters full of apologies and explanations, phone calls that went to voicemail, even a few attempts to visit that were turned away by the security system I'd installed. I read the letters once each, then filed them away without responding. Some wounds needed time to heal before forgiveness became possible, if it ever did. The hardest part was accepting that the loving son I'd raised had maybe never existed at all. Perhaps the David I'd treasured had always been a performance, a mask worn by someone who learned early that charm and manipulation could get him whatever he wanted. The little boy bringing me dandelions might have already been calculating what those flowers could earn him in maternal affection and future benefits. But even that harsh possibility couldn't erase the genuine joy I'd felt during those years of believing I was raising someone special. The love I'd given David had been real, even if his response had been calculated. That love had shaped me into a woman capable of great sacrifice and dedication. Now I was learning to direct those same qualities toward causes and people who deserved them. The Miller Foundation scholarship recipients sent me letters every semester sharing their struggles and achievements with the grandmother figure who'd made their education possible. Reading about Maria's pre-med studies or James's engineering projects or Sarah's social work internship reminded me that love invested wisely could still change lives and create positive legacies. 2 years after that terrible morning at the bank, I received a final letter from David. He'd served his minimum sentence for fraud and was starting over in a different state working as a paralegal for a public defender's office. The letter was different from the others, shorter, more honest, less focused on what I owed him, and more on what he'd cost both of us. He didn't ask for forgiveness or suggest reconciliation. Instead, he acknowledged that the person he'd become had been shaped by choices he'd made long before the financial desperation of recent years. The entitlement, the manipulation, the assumption that his happiness mattered more than my security or trust, these patterns had roots that went back to childhood decisions I'd been too loving to recognize. I never answered that letter, but I kept it. Someday, when enough healing had occurred, there might be space for a different kind of relationship with the man David was trying to become. But that day hadn't arrived yet, and might never come. Some betrayals cut too deep for simple apologies to repair, especially when they revealed fundamental character flaws rather than temporary lapses in judgment. The truth I'd learned was both harder and more hopeful than any illusion I'd clung to before. People we love can hurt us in ways we never imagined possible, but that same capacity for love can be redirected toward people and causes that honor it properly. The energy I'd spent trying to fix David's problems could instead help dozens of young people build better lives through education and opportunity. Standing in my garden last spring planting flowers Robert would have loved and planning my next adventure, I realized I'd finally learned the difference between loving someone and enabling them. True love sometimes requires setting boundaries that protect both people from destructive patterns. The hardest gift I'd given David was refusing to rescue him from the consequences of his choices, forcing him to find his own way toward becoming someone worthy of the love he'd abused. My life wasn't smaller now, despite losing the son who'd been its center for so many years. Instead, it had grown to include new friendships, meaningful work, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd chosen truth over comfortable lies. The foundation scholarships, the volunteer work at the local literacy center, the elderly neighbors who'd become surrogate family, these relationships were built on genuine mutual respect rather than guilt and manipulation. Sometimes on quiet evenings when loneliness threatened to overwhelm my hard-won peace, I'd remember that terrible moment when David's confident smile had vanished in the bank conference room, not because I took satisfaction in his shock and fear, but because it marked the moment I'd chosen my own well-being over his destructive demands. That choice had been the beginning of reclaiming my life from people who'd taken it for granted. The woman who'd stood up in that conference room and walked away from her son's manipulation had been stronger than she'd known. She'd built that strength over decades of hard work, honest dealing, and genuine care for others. When the crisis came, those qualities had provided the foundation for choosing difficult truth over comfortable deception. Now, as I prepare for my next chapter, perhaps teaching business skills to young entrepreneurs or traveling to visit scholarship recipients at their colleges, I carry the wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal without becoming bitter. The heart condition that David had tried to use as leverage for his theft had been successfully treated, giving me years of healthy life to invest in relationships and causes that deserved my energy. Love doesn't always look like giving people what they want. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior, even when that someone is your own child. David had to face the consequences of his choices without his mother's money to cushion the fall. Whether he learned from that experience was up to him, but I'd given him the gift of genuine accountability rather than fake rescue. The truth I'd pulled out of that folder hadn't just exposed David's lies. It had freed me from the prison of false obligations and misplaced guilt. No one, not even your own child, has the right to steal your security or manipulate your love for their selfish purposes. Recognizing that reality had been painful beyond words, but it had also been the beginning of authentic peace. If you've ever felt trapped by someone else's manipulation or betrayal, know that choosing truth over comfort is always worth the temporary pain. The foundation scholarships I award every year exist because I found the courage to protect my assets from someone who would have squandered them. The genuine friendships I've built exist because I learned to value people who give as much as they take. What would you have done in that bank conference room? Have you ever had to choose between enabling someone you love and protecting yourself from their destructive choices? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone else find the courage to choose truth over manipulation. If this story touched your heart or made you think differently about love and boundaries, please hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming betrayal and finding authentic happiness. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary for building a life worth living. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to be someone else's victim, even when that someone is your own family. May you find the strength to choose truth over comfort, and may that choice lead you to relationships and opportunities that truly honor the love you have to give.